Hey, I'm Emily Gaddick.
And I'm Kelly Jones. Normally, we're here in the Backstory studio behind the scenes, making you sweet historical radio. But recently, we went on a little field trip to a place called Appomattox Court House. When we got there, the battle was already raging.
Well, battle reenactment. It's not like anyone was dying, or even pretending to die, if we're being honest. I don't know if anybody watching has ever had the chance to go to a Civil War reenactment, but the thing that's most striking is the detail. The uniforms, the flags, the battle cries. All as close to how things were in 1865 as possible. Everybody knows exactly how to dress and act like they're from 1865.
And they also know exactly what Appomattox in 1865 is supposed to feel like. I spoke with a lot of reenactors, and the one thing they all mentioned is this idea that the country was coming together, that this was a moment of forgiveness and healing. Take Charles Johnson, who was fighting for the Union as Robert Fields when we arrived.
The beautiful aspect about in the McLean parlor, a document is written. The paper is federal, and the ink is Confederate ink. And in that moment, again, you have a working together and a unity in a way that you don't really think about. But even the surrender documents were a togetherness project.
It's safe to say that's not how the two generals would have experienced the moment of surrender back in 1865. In fact, that togetherness narrative wouldn't emerge for another 2 or 3 decades out of what University of Virginia historian Elizabeth Varon calls the cult of reunion in the final years of the 19th century.
I think we would do well at this anniversary to resist the temptation to see April 1865 through the lens of that cult of reunion, and to instead appreciate how raw people's emotions were, how raw anger and bitterness and mistrust were on April 9, 1865. 700,000 people had died. Appomattox was not a meeting of the minds and a serene healing moment, but a moment fraught with a lot of tension and uncertainty. Grant and Lee bring to that the table, really, the tables in the McLean parlor, two fundamentally different and incompatible visions of what an honorable peace would look like.
This was a purely military arrangement. Neither side ceded the moral high ground here. It was simply an agreement that Lee's men would give up their arms and go back home. There was no roadmap for what would happen next, and there was still a lot of doubt and mistrust in the air that day.
Right. Lincoln asked Grant to deal on strictly military terms. So for Lee and the other Southern officers, they might be allowed to leave that day, but there was no guarantee that they wouldn't be tried for treason later, once things got political.
And Grant had no idea if all these men who'd officially surrendered would actually go home as they promised, or if they'd simply take off their uniforms and fight on as guerrillas.
Really, nothing was decided that day beyond this purely military surrender. Both sides even disagreed about who came out on top.
And the fundamental question posed by Appomattox was the Confederate defeat the Union victory? The Union victory, a victory that was essentially one of right over wrong or of might over right. The dominant Northern view was that this was a victory of right over wrong, and that Northerners had won the moral high ground at Appomattox. But the Confederate answer was that this was a victory of might over right, and again, overwhelming numbers and resources, and that Confederates had not relinquished the moral high ground at Appomattox. And this is a very, very fundamental dispute.
I think that's kind of the strange thing about being at Appomattox in 2015. There's so much effort put into the details of that moment. Everyone knows what's coming next. You knew exactly when Lee would come up the road. You knew when he would go in to sign the surrender. You knew he would come out. And there's none of that doubt that was there on the actual day. And I think that makes it harder to see those kind of fundamental disagreements that still remained after the surrender was signed.
Yeah, there's no suspense. There's no uncertainty. What you end up with is something that's really detailed, but more like a diorama than real life. That tension in the air in April 1865, when lives were on the line, really can't be recaptured. It can't be reenacted. This is as close as we're going to get.
And And Appomattox isn't the only moment full of uncertainty at the end of the war. We explore the whole unclear, unpredictable year that was 1865 in our episode 1865, United States of Uncertainty.